Hey everyone, Ross Marchand here, Vice President of Policy for the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. And joining us today to talk about all things infrastructure is Reason Foundation's very own Senior Transportation Policy Analyst, Marc Scribner. So, Marc, first of all, thanks for coming on to talk about all this complicated transportation infrastructure mumbo jumbo. There is a lot to unpack here, is there not? I mean, House Democrats proposed what, a $1.5 trillion bill? Can we maybe go into some detail about what is inside of this bloated bill?
Yeah, absolutely, Ross, and thank you for the invitation and that very warm introduction. So yeah, as you said, the Moving Forward Act is a massive 2,300-page bill. Um, Tops out just over 1.5 trillion so far. There's still a chance to add more um, onto this before the floor vote. But the major component of that, or the largest component of that, is the 5-year surface transportation reauthorization, and that clocks in at just under $500 billion. So it's about a little under a third of the total spending that's proposed with this legislation.
Right. So you see a lot of spending, of course, $1.5 trillion worth of spending. But, going down the table of contents, you see things that you have to stand back and wonder for a second, why is this in the spending bill? So, for example, rail crew size mandates, hours of service regulations, how does that come into play? And what bearing do those regulations and mandates have on the future of transportation and, in particular, rail transportation in America?
Well, I think this bill largely reflects Democratic Party priorities, and that's why you see provisions such as the rail crew size mandate, which is a big ticket item for labor unions in the railroad industry. And then there's a number of other provisions that are giveaways to other key Democratic constituencies like the trial lawyers. So I mean, I think really what this is it's a wish list for Speaker Pelosi and the committee chairs in the House, which it's fine to have a wish list. I think both parties have their wish lists, but it's another to expect that this is going to move the needle on anything and actually get enacted, which I think the odds of this getting enacted are pretty slim. It's obviously possible for some of these provisions to make it into a final surface transportation reauthorization, or if Congress decides to go with some big multifaceted infrastructure stimulus. But the bill as it's currently designed is not going to get much further than a party line floor vote in the House. And we can unpack some of the things that it's proposing in terms of what the spending increases and what the focuses are for the House Democrats.
Right. And that is largely what you see. I mean, it's reflective of what their priorities are, which are not the preferred priorities of the American people. I mean, in particular, you see basically a wish list of scare quotes, green boondoggles, right? So electric vehicle charging subsidies, you see an extension of solar and wind tax credits. Can we talk a little bit more about that and what are some of the proposals surrounding some of these quote unquote green proposals?
Yeah, and I'm more familiar with the green transportation proposals. But for instance, with the electric vehicle charging or alt fuel fueling stations, you look at what they do, and it's really, I mean, that might benefit down the line some very wealthy electric car owners, the Tesla owners out there. But it does some interesting things. So if you take that money to build that electric vehicle charging station, you cannot charge a fee for those wealthy drivers who use it to charge. And that's, I mean, I think really the problem with that is if we actually shift away from fuel taxes, which provide about 90% of highway trust fund funding, to something, an alternative, a non-fossil fuel revenue source, you'd think you'd want to figure out how to perhaps charge people at the point of electric vehicle charging. That might be a viable way to do it. I'm not saying that's the best way to do it, but you'd think you might want to examine um, at least being able to recoup some of the costs of that infrastructure over time. I think this sort of precludes that kind of experimentation, that if you're a true new Green New Deal supporter, you would want to see those kind of questions answered. And then it does some, it's sort of based on some faulty assumptions about different types of transportation modes and how green they actually are. For instance, it proposes increasing intercity passenger rail, so Amtrak, spending for that by more than 300%. And we know just by looking at energy consumption data and ridership data that intercity buses, which are private, think the megabus, which directly compete with Amtrak, those buses are far greener on a passenger mile basis than Amtrak's trains. And it also proposes increasing spending for mass transit by more than 50%. And the data show that today's cars on the road are generally greener than transit buses when you factor in the actual bus ridership. So it does a lot of things in the name of being green that actually aren't very green, and could perversely shift some people away from what are actually greener private alternatives.
Right. They're just things that lack any sort of substance. They sound really good to a narrow subset, a vocal minority of people who claim to care about the environmental sort of bundle of issues, but they don't really drill down into the substance. And I think that's the thing that is really missing from this and similar pieces of legislation. And I think, look, we don't want to call it a starting point necessarily, but there's going to be a lot of iterations and a lot of debates over competing infrastructure proposals in the months to come, put forward by both parties. So to follow some of these developments, where could we go to learn more about infrastructure policy and the pros and cons of different proposals being weighed?
Well, we at Reason Foundation will be following all of this closely, and you can check out our work at reason.org.
Great. And we will be following the issue too at protectingtaxpayers.org. Well, thank you so much, Mark. And stay tuned because I'm sure there's plenty of more proposals and developments coming down the pike. Thanks.